So we are in the middle of a series called Summer at City North, and during this series, what we're doing is we're just kind of doing one-off messages. In other words, they're not really connected to each other, they're just sort of standalone. And we do that for a variety of reasons, but one of the cool things for me about it is that I kind of get to pick stuff I like a lot. And so over the last few months, we've had a couple different series that we've done that have been very different than what we've done in the past, where we've kind of done some narrative looks at stories. We've just taken a story and kind of looked at it narratively, gone like, what can we learn from this story, but not be super practical. It's, what's the story talking to us about? And then critically, I've tried to kind of put put the ball in your court. To say to God, like, God, what do you want to show me through this story? At the end of the day, I love the scriptures. I love teaching the Bible. I love pulling truth out of the Bible and making it applicable and relevant. And that's one of the things that I've heard so often from so many of you is like that you like that part of what I do. But in some of what we've done lately, I've tried intentionally to not tell you what you should know from it, not tell you what you should think, not tell you what you should do, because ultimately, I don't need you to learn how to listen to me. I need you to learn how to listen to God, right? And so we've tried to take a look at some narratives and just do some things differently. And today I wanted to actually continue that a little bit. We're going to look at one of my very favorite stories in the Bible. It is a story that's found in the book of Daniel. Now, if you grew up in church, or if you've been around church much, you know probably the story of Daniel and the lion's den. That is the most famous Daniel story. But there's another story in Daniel that is just phenomenal. The book of Daniel was written, scholars really debate on when exactly it was written, but somewhere between 600 and 800 BC. It's an old book. At this period of history, the Israelites, the nation of Israel, the Jewish people, God's chosen people, were captives in Babylon, which happened several times. Babylon was a superpower. They were, at different periods of history, like the most powerful superpower that existed in the ancient Near East. And so the Israelites just kept getting conquered by him. And in this particular cycle, what we find is that the nation of Israel are exiles, and a king named Nebuchadnezzar has gone and he's conquered Israel, and he's taken back the best and the brightest Israelites to the capital, to Babylon, with a goal. And the goal is to indoctrinate them to be Babylonians instead of Jews. And so what he does is he goes to his advisors and he says, like, hey, I want you to go find the very best and the brightest, the sharpest, most impressive young men that you can in all of Israel. I want you to bring them back to Babylon, and then we're going to start to indoctrinate them with all of our stuff. One of the very first things that they do is they change their names. And so there's 4 men that are identified in the book of Daniel. Daniel being one, as you might imagine. The other 3, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now, those names might not be familiar to you because they're their Jewish names. But once the king gets these young men to Babylon, he changes their names into names that you may know: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Or Abednego. Random note, the D and the N, we flip them in how we say it. It's Abednego, if you're a names person. If you're not, say it however you want. Abednego. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Man, that's going to mess with me now, sorry. Abednego. Anyway, it doesn't matter. That guy. So the king takes them back. He changes their names. And then he begins in Daniel 1 to try to change their diet. And he does it by offering them all these incredible king kind of foods. And the young men say, we're not going to eat that. And there's this whole thing. And they say, we're going to only eat vegetables, which sounds awful. Like they've got red meat. I don't eat the red meat. I don't understand. If you're a vegetarian, great. I don't understand at all. 0% I understand. So try to feed them all this food. They say, we're not going to do that. We're going to do this. And what happens is interesting. The king becomes so impressed with these 4 young men because of their conviction, their willingness to kind of stand up for what they think, and the fact that what they thought worked. They ended up more healthy than the men who were eating the food from the king's table. And so what happens is these young men begin to kind of rise up the ranks of Babylon. And they're the king's trying to indoctrinate them, but they're realizing these guys have some skills and some abilities. And so they eventually become, they like land spots in the government of this region, which is great, but it causes a problem. And so we're going to pick up We're going to pick up at the beginning of chapter 3. In Daniel chapter 2, there's nothing that happens that has anything to do with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's all to do with Daniel and his story later on. But in chapter 3, we pick up, and what happens is right at the very beginning of chapter 3, the king builds a statue. And the statue is about 90 feet high. So it's big. It's about 90 feet high. It's about the height of a 9-story building, for context. About 90 feet high. And when he builds it, it's a statue of himself. And he makes a rule. He says, anytime anyone in the land hears the music of the harps and the lyres and all the different instruments, anytime you hear the music, you have to bow down and worship my statue. Now, in Babylonian culture, kings often presented themselves as gods. And this is exactly what Nebuchadnezzar is doing in this moment. He's setting himself up as a god to his people. So anytime you hear the music, bow down. And there's a problem with that. Which is that Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego do not believe, appropriately, that it is right for them to bow down to anything other than God himself. That it is not right. This is 10 commandments, right? Do not have any other gods before me. And so Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego make the decision that they're not going to bow. Now, Daniel's out of the narrative at this point. And it's just Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they're what their exact title was, I don't remember offhand, but they have governmental positions. And so the music comes on, and here they are, and they don't bow. We find out that some astrologers go to the king, and they're like, hey, king, those Jews, the ones you're trying to indoctrinate, they don't care about your rules. They're not doing what you said. And the king gets angry. We're going to pick up our story right there. We find out King Nebuchadnezzar is angry, and he summons Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to come to talk to him. So we're going to pick up Daniel chapter 3, starting in verse 14. Nebuchadnezzar said to them, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold that I have set up? He says, now when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? And this is an interesting line, because the king has established the rules. When the music plays, bow down and worship the statue. The king has established the consequence. If you don't, this is what's going to happen. They build a big furnace. And if you don't do what I say, you're going to get thrown in the furnace. This wasn't just a rule for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This was the rule that they established across the whole kingdom. This is the punishment if you don't do what I say. And then the king tacks on, then what God will save you. And he tacks this on because he knows. Remember, he's been trying to indoctrinate these guys. The Jewish people were well known for the fact that they had this different God than everyone else that they worshiped, that they served. They were a monotheistic religion, which was very unusual, meaning they only had one God, Yahweh, the God that we know. This is very unusual in the ancient world. And so Nebuchadnezzar is essentially calling out God in this moment. He would have been very aware of their religious beliefs. So he's saying, come on, I've got power. I've got all the power on earth over you. You're going to do what I say, or you're going to die, because your God can't do anything. And in this moment, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego do a thing that, for me, they say a line that for me is one of the most powerful and courageous things that is recorded anywhere in the scriptures. In this moment, they have a choice. We can do what the king says, or we can die. And this is their response. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to defend ourselves before you about this. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us. And he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up. I mean, listen, there's phrases that I would use that are not the most, There's phrases you could use to describe this. I don't understand. I think I'm a person with a lot of faith. I've taken a lot of steps for God, a lot of big steps. I don't know how you stand before a king and say, hey, listen, here's the deal. Tough. Like, do what you want. I love the progression of their statement. We believe that our God is able. He can save us. Actually, we believe he will save us. So we don't even need to defend ourselves to you. Our God can save us. We believe our God will save us. But even if he doesn't, not doing it. I mean, the courage that it would take, the presence of mind to, in that moment when you would be faced with literally the fear of life or death, to be able to not just stand up and kind of blubber your way through, and to be able to say, we don't need to defend ourselves. Our God will save us. And if he doesn't, that's okay, is extraordinary. So as the story continues, Nebuchadnezzar becomes furious, as you might imagine, with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And his attitude toward them changed, meaning his attitude up to this point, he's been impressed with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He has placed them in positions of power and of authority, even as foreigners, as exiles. He's given them responsibility and authority. And now all of a sudden he's like, no, man, I'm done with these guys. His attitude toward them changes. He orders the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual. So at this point, like, you got to understand what the king is doing here is he's going, we're going to take care of business. And I'm going to show them, I'm going to prove to everyone, you don't talk to me that way, and I don't care who your gods are, they can't touch me. This is all the pridefulness you could imagine happening in a single moment. The king heats the furnace 7 times hotter than usual, and he commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and were thrown into the blazing furnace. That's an interesting detail. Again, if you've been around, you know that I've said many times, like, when there's a little detail in the scriptures that's like, why are you telling me what all they're wearing? That's for a reason. Why do you think they might be including all this clothing? Because you know what's real flammable? Clothes. They tend to catch fire. Hey, they're wearing all these clothes that should get burned up like that. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. It's a hot fire. I'm a little bit of a pyro. That is a Schultz family man tradition. You're born into it. My dad primarily heated the house with wood every winter, and so I love building fire. Like, I love building a fire, sitting there and watching it. And I like to get close enough that it's real warm, you know. But like, there's a point. There's a point where it's like, nope. All right, I'm gonna back up a little bit, right? Like, there's a point where it becomes uncomfortable. The furnace is so hot that it kills the 3 men immediately. The soldiers, I'm sorry. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fall into the blazing furnace. Now, a moment later, we find out King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement. And he looks at his advisors. And he says, hey, there were 3 guys, right? There were 3. 3, right? 3? And that's a low number. 1, 2, 3. They say, yes, there were 3. We counted. This isn't a hard one to mess up. And now he looks and he says, look. I see 4 men walking around in the fire. And they're unbound and unharmed. And the 4th looks like a son of the gods. There are many scholars who actually believe, and I don't know where I land on this, it doesn't matter at the end of the day, but there are many scholars that actually believe the phrasing there is that it was Jesus himself in Hebrew. I don't know, but it's a cool picture. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God. Well, that's a different way to say it. Come out here. I love to try to put myself in the story. Like, I think sometimes we just read these like, I don't know, like distant. This is the moment where the king's like, uh-oh, I may have overestimated my power here a touch. I might be in over my head. Sir, hey, you guys, servants of the Most High God. Come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. These are all their I'm trying to say co-workers. What is it? Peers. Yeah, there you go. So that's what they were. They were satraps. Prefects, governors, and royal advisors. So all of a sudden, all of their peers are around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes, remember those? Here they are again. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Now, if you are a pyro like me, you know that you do not have to be in a fire to smell like the fire. You don't even have to be especially close to the fire to smell like fire. If you're in the general vicinity, you're going to come out smelling like fire. Nebuchadnezzar looks at him and he says, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any gods except their own God. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut to pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble. For no other God can save in this way." And then the king gives them a promotion. So I love this story. I love this story because there's a lot of reasons. I love this story because of the response of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Like, it's the kind of response that when you read it, I hope that you think like, man, I would love to have faith like that. I would love to be able to stand. I remember when I was, I don't even know how old I was when Columbine happened. And if you're of a certain age and you remember that well, you remember there were stories that began to come out afterwards about the fact that the gunmen in the Columbine shootings had asked some of the kids, like they were targeting Christians, and they had asked some of the kids, like, "Do you believe in God?" And if they answered yes, they shot them. And there was a story about an individual named Cassie Bernal, I believe was her name, who was like kind of the most famous, who with a gun to her face said, "Yes, I believe in Jesus," and as a teenager died because of her faith. And I remember, being in youth group and like that kind of getting sensationalized and it being like, well, what would you do? And even then thinking like, well, good grief, I think I would do that. But I've never had to answer that in that situation. I mean, thinking about the response of these three young men, I mean, when we say young men, like we're talking probably late teens, maybe early to mid-20s, maybe, at the very oldest, like mid-20s. Their whole life is in front of them. They have understand, these guys would have been set up. They would have had everything, like the world was their oyster. They would have had money. They would have had fame. They would have had status. They would have had all the things that as people it can be easy to long for. And to think, if I have those things, then life's easy and it's simple. And they have them all in this moment. I love the story because of their response. I love the story because of the deliverance of God. That's one of my favorite things about the Old Testament in particular of the Bible. It's just story upon story upon story upon story of God delivering his people, of God's faithfulness through the generations. Those stories, like this story is not just a story in a book, it's our faith heritage. One of the reasons that I have such deep confidence in God is not just because of what he's done in my life. It's because what he's done in my life mirrors what he's done for thousands of years. And so I trust it. I love this story for that reason. I also love this story because of the way that they handled themselves in the midst of this. Not just in their response, but in some of the things that they didn't do. And so what I want to do as we get ready to finish up here is I do think that it's pretty critical that when we look at Bible stories like this, we ask, like, what do we see here? What is it that God is showing us? What is it that we can learn from this story? What is it that we can take away? Now, here's the thing. As I mentioned before, I don't just want to tell you this is what this story means. Because one of the interesting things about a relationship with God is when you walk with God long enough, you start to see the Bible differently. I'm going to be very clear what I mean by that. I'm not saying that the scriptures change, but I change. And as I change, I see things I didn't see before. I mean, the easiest example of this is to think about, if you have a kid and you teach them some of the basic Bible stories, they're going to see very simple things in the stories. Well, that's great. That's a kid, right? I preached a big, long series on David a few months ago, and the way that I see the story of David now because of my own journey is totally different than the way I saw it even 8, 9, 10 years ago. So the scriptures don't change, but I change. And God opens my eyes to things that I've never seen before. And so I don't just want to tell you, here's what the story means, because the story can mean all kinds of things. God can speak to you through these stories in all kinds of ways, depending on where you are, where your faith is, what your experiences are. But I did write down a few things that I think might be appropriate or applicable for you. And so I don't know what you need to take out of this, but if something strikes you, write it down. What do we learn? There's a couple major things that I think we learn about God here. Number one is that God positioned these guys. There's a principle woven throughout the scriptures that God does this incredible thing where he redeems bad situations, meaning he takes bad things and then uses them to accomplish good things. And we see this starting very early in the scriptures, and we see it never ending. Like he's constantly taking bad situations, bad scenarios, and redeeming them and using them for great things. That's exactly what he does with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You can't possibly look at exile in a foreign land and indoctrination by a foreign government as a positive, except that God can use it for just that. And so God takes these 3 young men and he positions them. He gifts them, and then he positions them inside the government to make a difference in a way that they never could have otherwise. And kind of as a 1B to that, God delivers them. I mean, that's a simple takeaway, but don't miss the power of it. They shouldn't have lived. They shouldn't have survived. And they even, in their response, they even recognized, there's a chance we won't make it through this. And we believe God's going to deliver us, but he might not. Do you have that kind of faith? That you can trust that God will, but if he doesn't, it's okay? That's a whole different level of faith. Now, God does deliver them. Don't miss the power of that. And when he does, God uses that deliverance as a way to impact the king. So God positions them, and then he delivers them. Maybe you're in a place where in your faith you struggle to see God as a deliverer. You struggle to see God as someone who truly does provide and position. Maybe you have a hard time seeing the reality of your life through the lens or with the perspective that I don't understand what God's doing, but I know that what he is doing, he is working to bring good out of it. Maybe you really struggle with that perspective. Maybe for you it's just it's hard to see the forest through the trees. Maybe for you it's there's this and there's this and there's this and there's this, and I don't know. I can't even see how God is in it. Then perhaps for you this story needs to be a reminder that God positions and he provides and he delivers. And you don't always see it in the moment. I mean, God could have delivered Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in all kinds of ways before they went into the fire. And I imagine if I'm in their shoes, I'd have been kind of hey, God, you want to, anytime now, you could just strike those guys dead right now before we get to the fire. That'd be great. But he doesn't. They trusted. So maybe for you need help truly believing that God delivers, truly believing that God is working things for good even when you can't see it. And so maybe for you coming out of this story, maybe you need to spend some time in prayer, just asking that God would help you to have the right perspective of his action, the right perspective of what's happening around you, that you wouldn't see it through your own lens, but you would see it through his. One of the other things I love about the story is that obviously Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't back down when that choice could have cost them everything. They stood up for what was right. They stood up for what God commanded. But you know what else they didn't do? They didn't make a big fuss about it. This is a little bit hidden in the story, but sometimes, again, as it kind of like to tie it back to what we talked about earlier with the Supreme Court decision, sometimes I think Christians think like it's our job to protect God, which is a rather silly and arrogant thing to think. God does not, he doesn't need my protection. I don't have much to offer him in that regard. As if if we stand up and yell loud enough about all the things that are wrong, that now God's going to make it to the next generation. I got news. God's making it to the next generation. Because he's big, and he's powerful, and he's made it to this generation. Now, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood up for what was right. But they weren't out yelling at everybody about, like, the king shouldn't be making this statue, and he shouldn't be making everybody do this, and this is wrong. And they just kept their mouths shut and did what they knew was right. I think that is a profound truth in this story. Profound truth in this story. So maybe for some of us, maybe we've been Christians a long time, and maybe we really value like standing up for what's right, but maybe we don't know how to stand up for what's right the right way. And maybe that needs to be our prayer. God, help me to learn how, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, help me learn how to speak when I need to and otherwise to keep my yap shut. Can I be real honest? Like, that's one of the things that I've had to learn the hard way over the years. Because I'm a bear poker. Just like it. Some people are like, run from conflict. I'm like, let me start it. I start some conflict and then watch. It's terrible. It's a terrible character flaw. But it's true. So maybe for some of us, we need to pray, God, help me learn to stand for what's right the right way. And then the last thing that I wrote down was, that I think is significant in this, is that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were close enough to God to know what was right and to obey it no matter the cost. Like, it's abundantly obvious that God was their first and only priority in life. They were positioned with wealth, with fame, with status, and they did not care. They were positioned next to the king of the most powerful nation on earth, and they did not care. They were willing to give it all away. And that idea, that disposition of their hearts, it just reminds me of so much in the New Testament, especially in the way that Paul would write, and in the things that Jesus would say. Specifically in Philippians chapter 1, where Paul writes, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. Like, he's being threatened with death, and his followers, Paul's his little band is like, well, but Paul, what are you going to do? They're going to kill you. And he's like, yeah, but if I get to live, then I get to tell people about Jesus. And if I die, I get to be with him. So either way, I'm great. And people didn't know what to do with that reality, with that perspective. Because for Paul, there was no second. There was nothing else. There was Jesus and Jesus alone. And it's the same mindset that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had. There's nothing else. There's God. There is our God. He is our source. He is our provider. He is our deliverer. He is our fortress. He is our anchor. He is everything. He is our life. He is our breath. And no matter what happens, we're good because we have him. It is so obvious that for them, God was absolutely everything. And so maybe for some of us, maybe God is like most things. Maybe God is a lot of things. But is God like, is he really everything? Is he really everything? That's a question that it's very easy to say yes to and not think about the implications of. Were God to take away all the things in your life that you care about, what happens then? Were God to take away all the things that you think are a blessing from him, what happens then? Is God everything, or is God just something? And so maybe for some of us, the takeaway needs to be like, I would love to have that kind of faith, but to be honest, there's things that I value more. There's things that I don't want to lose. There's things that I don't want to give up. Now here's the deal. God doesn't always ask for everything. But if he does, are you willing to be open-handed and to trust him no matter what? So maybe for some of us, the prayer needs to be, God, be everything to me. Help me to die to myself. Help me to die to myself so it's not even me who's living anymore, but it's you who's living in me. Like, imagine what life would be like if you could get so close to Jesus that no matter what came your way, you could say, I don't need to defend myself. I trust my God no matter what, and he will deliver me. But even if he won't, I'm okay. Maybe you feel like you're there, and if you are, that's great. Keep going. Keep going, keep going, keep going. But my guess is that for many of us, if we're real honest with ourselves, we probably think, I trust God, but there's a lot of things that I wouldn't be willing to give up for him. If you really asked, your status, your position, your money. Imagine what life would be like if your faith was so strong that you truly could say, I will follow you no matter what. Wherever, whenever, however you at, I will go, I will do. Imagine the things right now that you get your pants in a wad about that you wouldn't care because it doesn't matter. Imagine the conflict in your life that may be important, but that maybe would vanish. I don't know what it looks like for you, but I know that when we read stories like this, when we look at people like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, whatever the takeaway is for you, at the end of the day, God wants us, all of us, God wants us all to have the depth of relationship with him, the closeness to him, the nearness to him, that we have assurance, confidence, that no matter what happens, we are okay because we have him. And so for all of us, my prayer, my hope, for myself, is that God would never, ever, ever be anything less than everything, as corny and cliche as that sounds. That truly God would be everything. Because when he's everything, nothing can touch you, even flames from a giant furnace. Let me pray for us. Father, thank you for your love and your grace. Thank you that you are good and that you are kind. Father, today we ask that for every one of us that's here today that has placed our faith in you, for those of us who have chosen to trust you with everything that we are, I pray that today you would give us strength, you would give us courage, that you would, whatever kind of stage of faith we find ourselves at, whatever spiritual maturity, whatever depth of trust we have in you, Father, I pray today that you would speak to us and that you would clearly call us deeper. That somehow today we would, there would be like a longing for more of you inside us. A longing to have the kind of faith that we see in these three young men in this story. That there would be a desperation to be content. A desperation to find peace. A desperation to find all that we need in you alone so that nothing else can shake us. And so, Father, for everyone in this room that is, as I kind of prayed earlier, for everybody that's weary, that's struggling, that has pain and wounds, that's just got stuff in their life that right now is kind of locking them up, that they can't see past. Father, I pray that you would give us perspective. I pray that whatever the situations, whatever the circumstances are, you would give us perspective. That you would help us to see those things through your eyes, not through our own. That you would help us to know in the depth of our soul that no matter how surprised we are or how thrown off we are or how unprepared we were for whatever things are coming to mind, that we would have the confidence and the assurance in the depth of us that you weren't surprised, you weren't caught off guard, and that even when we're freaking out and we're worrying and we're scrambling and trying to make everything work, that in those moments you have already been working for our good. And that there is nothing that prevents you from working for our good. So help us trust you. Help us walk with you. And lead us down a path that forces us into surrender so that we can find the peace and contentment that only comes from you. We love you. It's in your name we pray.